And so if COVID didn't go wrong, something would have. It's just that we wouldn't prepared for anything, whether it was COVID or anything else. So what's happening now was destined to happen. It was unavoidable. But what's also unavoidable is what's going to happen next. Because what's going to happen next is going to be much worse than what's already happened, because we've been able to mitigate the downturn so far because we've been able to keep printing dollars, and we've been able to spend those dollars because the value hasn't collapsed. When this kicks into a whole new gear is when the dollar collapses. And then it doesn't do you any good that the government printed up some dollars and gave them to you, because there's very little you can buy with them.
When the only constant in life is change, you need to be ready. This is the Man-Made Survival Show.
Hello everyone, my name is Jose Prado with ManMadeSurvival. Thank you so much for coming back to the channel and watching this video. I really do appreciate it, because today we're going to be talking about a very important subject, which is of course the economy. And it doesn't really matter what political view you have. You still have to go to work, you still have to pay your bills, you still have to come home and cook dinner and everything. So this subject is going to affect everyone. Doesn't matter how rich they may be or how poor they may be. This subject is very important, especially with all the information that has come out in the past few days. So I encourage you to stay all the way to the end. And not only that, I encourage you to share this in your social media with your friends and family, because we're still trying to get to the 1,000 subscribers, and we could only do it through your help. And, since you're already on social media, I would really appreciate it if you could just share that video on there and help us reach more people, because potentially this information could be life-saving. So you can help us reach more people and help them out and get them prepared just by simply hitting the share button. Before I get into the whole podcast about everything that I want to talk to you about, because as I mentioned in the previous podcast, that all this information goes together, because with the social unrest and the economic collapse that we're seeing, both of those could actually give the green light to China to go ahead and attack the United States, whether it would be a nuclear attack or a conventional weapon. The point is that the pieces are being moved right now, and we could be hours away from a war. God only knows exactly when, but the point is that we can see all the signs, and all the signs are there, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you on the next podcast. On this podcast is going to be about the situation that we're seeing ourselves in with the economy. So anyways, I do want to remind you that this podcast is sponsored by my store, ManMadeSurvivalStore.com. And when you go on there, whatever it is that you're preparing for, whether it's an EMP, a nuclear disaster, or just trying to find the perfect gift this holiday season, you can rest assured that all the items on there are going to help you in your survival, in your preparedness. And, not only that you're going to be helping yourself, buying that stuff for your own preparedness, but you could also help someone else if you're going to be giving them a gift that of something that you can find at the store. So I would really appreciate it if you could support us through that way. Also, I want to remind you about the partner that we have is GreenMedicineEncyclopedia.com. Green Medicine Encyclopedia is a science-based encyclopedia providing researched evidence for nutritional medicine and natural health therapies. And the best thing about it is that they're giving $40 off with the coupon code ManMadeSurvival. And it could also be a perfect gift, because, as I've mentioned in the past, it's gonna be really important for you to have this type of software. But not only that, for you to print it out, have a hard copy of it, put it in a folder, store it somewhere, because one of the things that we have seen in Venezuela is that they are struggling with health, because they cannot afford to go to the doctor. They can barely afford to buy food at the grocery store. So going to the doctor in many cases is just out of the question. And, they're suffering from very basic diseases. And because they don't have the knowledge to how to treat it, they're suffering the consequences. So this Green Medicine Encyclopedia is actually very important for, very important prep for you to have, as I said, overall for your team, your alliance, and everybody else. I do want to mention, though, for the people who have actually gone to the store and seen the placeholder for Green Medicine Encyclopedia, I do want to tell you that we don't sell you the product. All right, you have to go to greenmedicineencyclopedia.com to buy it. When you read the description on there, all right, it's going to have the link that is going to take you to the store, and then there you can put in the coupon code ManMadeSurvival to get $4 off. The reason I want to mention is because I have several people who have tried to buy it from my store, but that is not the case. You have to read the description. That's only going to take you to the original website, which that's where you would buy it from. So again, thank you for your support. Okay, let's get into this podcast. Let's get into the information because it's very important that we talk about it. All right. For a very long time, the American people have actually, I guess you can say, enjoy the consequences of printing money out of thin air. And it has been happening for a long time without any real problems because, the American has a lot of assets with the reserve currency. We're the superpower around the world. A lot of people want to make business with the United States. There's a lot of bonds the United States issues. And that is one of the reasons why it has taken a very long time for this system to actually collapse. Now, the question is, how much longer do we have? The answer to the question, I don't have it, because depending where you look at the data and who you ask, it really shows that there's no clear estimate, but the writing is on the wall. You can only print out so much money. All right. And the kind of the analogy that I use is that we have kicked the can so far down the road that it has actually gone off the cliff. But what happened is that the Federal Reserve, they built a bridge right under the cliff where the can actually hit. And as we keep kicking that can down this bridge into the ocean, we continue to actually expand the bridge, making it a lot longer. But eventually it's going to get too expensive to sustain that bridge, that's keeping the can from falling into the deepest depth of the ocean. All right, that's the easiest way that I could actually illustrate it for you, because the can has already gone off the cliff. All right, the only reason it's being held up right now is because of the Federal Reserve building that bridge. So you have to get prepared for it, because eventually the Federal Reserve won't be able to help anyone. The government won't be able to help anyone. The status of reserve currency that the United States enjoys one day is going to go away. It's more than likely that with the Great Reset that everybody's starting to talk about, that's when it's going to happen, because now they're talking about bringing out a digital currency and everything that goes along with it. But the point is that even if this is all planned out, right, that the collapse of the United States is planned out, guess what? It's still going to collapse. That's why it's important for you to prepare now while the United States is still strong, still rich. Your dollar hasn't collapsed yet. That's why it's important for you to prepare and make sure that you put yourself in a place where even if you cannot go to the grocery store, you still feed your family. Even the grid is off because either an EMP happened or just simply because you cannot afford to pay the power bill, your family is still warm at night during the winter. There's a lot of things that you can put in place right now from when that day happens. And if you don't do it now, the window of opportunity is going to close even more on you. As I've mentioned in the previous podcast, the window of opportunity for civil unrest more than likely is only 3 days away before it closes, right? And I told you on that podcast that you really need to sit down and think about all the preps that you have and imagine the crap hit the fan, and you have to make a plan with what you already have, whatever it is that you have, whether you have 2 weeks worth of food or you have 2 years worth of food. You go ahead and have a plan. You go through your inventory and you make sure that everything is in place, that your guns are clean, that you have enough ammo, that everything's in place. You're patrolling your area 24/7, because the unrest could be very devastating. Now, the same thing, I bring it to you, but with the economy. What you can do now is try to make yourself debt free as much as possible. And one of the aspects that we talk about when we talk about preparedness financially, or when we talk about finances in the prepper community, better phrase, is that you need to have precious metals, right? I want to go into the prepping real quick and talk about it for a few minutes, because it's very important. Because we have heard in the prepper community that you need gold, right? But they don't really give a very specific reason why. And that's one of the things that I want to fight, is that I want to bring foundational principles to the prepper community, and gold is also one of them. Right? I have talked about food in the past, why you need 2 years, and I give a very detailed explanation why. All right, and that would be a fundamental or a foundation for the preparedness community with food. I've done it with other subjects, and now I'm doing it with gold. Why do you need gold as a prepper? Right. The one that a lot of people come to mind when they think about gold in the prepper community is, barter and trade. Because if you're gonna have gold with you, you're gonna go to someone and you're gonna try and trade it. That has happened in Venezuela. The people who actually own gold, they have actually traded for food, right? But in a lot of cases where people did have the gold, the people who were actually trying to trade, they were not interested in gold. They were interested in other commodities. They were interested in other things. So gold wasn't very helpful in that aspect. And that's one of the things that a lot of people love to point out, that you won't be able to eat your gold, right? That you just wasting your money, wasting your time buying gold. And I have to respectfully disagree, because gold should be the very last thing that you use, because if the system collapses, eventually it's going to get rebuilt. All right. And then when that gets rebuilt, then the new government or the new system that the government comes up with, they're going to trade their currency that they're going to give out to the citizens. They're going to trade it for gold. So that's going to be your prime opportunity to actually, use the gold that you have been holding on for probably for many, many years. And in some cases for generations. I was listening to Dave Ramsey a long, long time ago, several years ago. And there was a guy that called and said that he had $100 million worth of gold. And he didn't know what to do with it. And Dave Ramsey just told him, just sell it. It's just an asset that's just sitting there not making any money, and it's just a waste of time. And I remember thinking that, for one, if something was to happen, then he could just flee the country, take his gold with him, and trade it in the currency that he would be fleeing into. But not only that, if he was to stay in the United States, because let's say a pandemic happened, as we're seeing now, where they're going to restrict you from leaving the country, well, whatever gold you have now, you're going to be able to trade it with the government. For example, right now, if you have $1,900, if you have 1 ounce of gold, you can get $1,900 from the government. All right, so that's how that would work. In private, I don't believe it would be. You may not find that very many people, because now this is my opinion, that the people in the Preppers fencing area who will trade food and other goods for gold are the people who have plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of ammo, plenty of guns, whatever. And that would be the people you would do it with. But I would save it for when a government comes around and they reestablish another, currency system. And the Great Reset that everybody's starting to talk about, it pretty much points to that direction. And I mean, I talked about the Great Reset, very little a couple months ago when it came out of Davos, and they pretty much said that in January 2021, that they were going to pretty much discuss more openly what that looked like, and more information is coming out. So, expect a podcast coming from that, because we can prepare. They're letting us know whether the collapse is an accident or it's planned. You can still prepare. You can still come out on top. And if you don't do anything about it, that's the only time you're going to suffer for not doing anything. All right, so let's get into the articles that I have for you, because now I feel like I'm just rambling. So the first one that I have for you is the gold solution to America's debt crisis. That's from Zero Hedge. And just going off the headline real quick, I do want to mention that the United States does not have enough gold whatsoever to really pay off the debt that it has. All right, if I'm not mistaken, it only has about 8,000 tons of gold, I think, something like that, which comes out to an equivalent of $500 billion. So if the United States, for whatever reason, decided to sell off all the gold and try to pay its bills with it, they will go through $500 billion probably within a week. All right, we have gone through trillions and trillions of dollars in a very small amount of time, compared to what gold will do for the government now. Will they manipulate the markets? Maybe. But the point is that right now, as it sits, we have no gold, or not enough gold, to cover any of our expenses, or at least not for a very long time. The article goes on to say, basically, the United States is going broke, which, that is not a big secret. It's something that we have been talking about for a while. I've said this ever since I started this podcast, that we're going to one day look like Venezuela. I don't want that, but the way that the government is taking us, it looks that way. Now, a $27 trillion debt would be fine if we had a $50 trillion economy. But we don't have a $50 trillion economy. We have about a $21 trillion economy. At least we did, which means that our debt is bigger than our economy. When is the debt to GDP ratio too high? When does a country reach the point that either turns things around or ends up like Greece? Economists Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt carried out a long historical survey going back 800 years, looking at individual countries, or empires in some cases, that had gone broke or defaulted on their debt. They put the danger zone at a debt to GDP ratio of 90%. Once it reaches 90%, they found a turning point arrives. At that point, $1 of debt yields less than $1 of output. Debt becomes an actual drag on the growth. What is the current U.S. debt to GDP ratio? About 130%. The reaction to the pandemic caused a spike. It was previously about 105%. We are deep into the red zone, that is, and we're not pulling out. The U.S. has dangerous debt to GDP ratio, trillions plus dollar deficits, more spending on the way. We're headed for a sovereign debt crisis. That is not an opinion. It's based on the numbers. How do we get out of this? For the elites, there's really only one way out, and that's inflation. All right, and the reason that that's inflation is because they're going to use that in order for them to pretty much manipulate gold. And really, as far as I understand it, gold does not have like a cap. They can make it to be whatever they want, pretty much. They could raise it from $1,900 that is right now to, $10,000 or $20,000 an ounce. The point is that they could actually use that to try to pay the debt or at least bring it down a little bit, but we don't have enough. That 8,000 tons of gold is not enough to cover not just the debt, but our expenses. We have Medicaid, we have Medicare, we have food stamps, we have home assistance. There's a whole bunch of other things that the government uses all that money for that will really suck it up real fast. And I'm saying that eventually we'll get to the point where the United States government would not be able to afford to have safety nets anymore. And as I mentioned in the past, countries like from where I come from, Mexico, really anywhere south of the border, they don't have those type of social safety nets. All right, and as Red Rancher, said it very, I guess you could say, very cleverly, is that safety net becomes a hammock, where people just stay there. And in some cases, it's not those people's fault because they really can't get out of the net. But in other cases, the government makes it very easy for people to just be on the net, on the safety net, and not do anything. Now, the stock market really reflects a lot of how the rich people are reacting to everything. The stock market is not really for someone broke like me. For one, I don't understand it, and two, I don't have money to invest in it. And the only people who are actually investing in all that is the big corporations, your Amazon, your Google, your airlines, and all those other ones. They are the ones that the government is actually helping. The Federal Reserve has spent pretty much since September of last year propping up the stock market, pouring trillions and trillions of dollars into it. If you remember back last year when this whole scenario started coming out about liquidity problems in the banks, it was about the stock market as well, because if I'm remembering correctly, the Fed was giving them, what's that word? They were giving them loans, but I cannot remember right now what's the name of it. But anyways, the point is that if it wasn't for the Federal Reserve's propping up these stock markets, all these bubbles, then the bubbles would have already popped on them too. All right? As I mentioned in the past, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. You're going to suffer the consequences of the bubbles popping, of the U.S. economy coming down to the ground. And not only that, if the reserve currency becomes something else, then we're going to feel the pain even more. All right, so right here I have a headline that I want to give to you, but I want to play a Peter Schiff video next to it. So here's the headline, and it comes from Zero Hedge. To save the stock market, the Fed threatens destruction of trillions in middle class retirements. Here's that video.
50 points. At its low, it was down about 950 points. That's a decline of about 2.3%. S&P not quite as bad, only down 1.86%, because the composite down 1.64%. Remember, what's holding up the market are these COVID stay-at-home stocks that everybody keeps buying, because the catalyst for this morning's sell-off had to do with renewed fears, that we wouldn't be getting a stimulus anytime soon, or at least before the election, and also that COVID is picking up around the world, in the US and in Europe, delaying the so-called reboot of the economy, the second leg of the V, looking a bit emaciated. And so people now have more reasons to sell the recovery stocks, right? The stocks that have to do with the economy coming back, and piling into the stocks that are profiting from everybody staying at home and not going out and not working. The question is, how long can this stay-at-home trade continue? Because all of these stocks are already way overvalued anyway. So even if the economy does continue in shutdown mode, at some point these stocks have got to go down. And of course, if all of the people who are staying at home and shopping never go back to work and never actually have a job, and the only money they have to spend is the money the Fed creates out of thin air, eventually the dollar is going to collapse and their real purchasing power is going to go down along with it. And a lot of these stocks are going to crash because they're not going to have any real revenue, because their customers are going to be broke, and they're not going to be able to sell these higher cost products, because inflation will drive up the cost of producing all these products that their consumers really can't afford to buy. But
all right, so very important what he said right there, that there is a connection between the stock market and the buying power of the American people, because the Fed is printing a lot of money in order for them to prop up all these bubbles. All right, so that's why it's important for us to prepare for it now. All this information is free and available to you, and you have to act upon it. You cannot just sit back and think that somebody's going to fix it eventually. Yes, they will, but you might have to go through the hardship before someone fixes it. Something that I want to remind everyone, and not just in the prepper community, but regular citizens abroad, when they wonder why things have not collapsed, it is because, for one, there's a lot of people working very hard for things not to fail. For example, with the food shortages. The food shortages would have been a lot worse if we not had people trying really hard not to let it collapse. All right. Yes, they did close the packaging, the meat packaging places. They did force the ranchers and everybody else to dump the milk, to call the cattle, to call the pigs and everything. But there were also forces who were trying to fight it very hard. Trump did pass the executive order saying that we needed to go ahead and reopen, and that they needed to work and not let the pretty much the meat processing plants collapse all throughout the United States, because that could bring food shortages. The same thing is happening with farmers. They're working the land, they're working very hard, and they want to get it to the stores desperately. So there are people who are working very hard, tirelessly, making sure that the food supply chain does not collapse. All right. So the same thing can be said about the economy. Even though they're doing everything that is wrong for the economy, they're the ones that keeping it the way it is. By lowering interest rate, by giving a stimulus, by inflating bubbles and everything. That does create prosperity in the short term, but we are going to have to prepare for the long term. All right. Let me remind you that Venezuela has been going down through their crisis for about 7 to 8 years now, from the time it began, and they saw the writing on the wall years before Maduro took the presidency, or whatever it's called. They saw with Chavez, with Hugo Chavez. They saw the writing on the wall. The preppers there tried to prepare their best that they could, but several things happened. One, they ran out of time. They did not prepare. One, they ran out of time. Two, they did not prepare long enough, because they didn't think the crisis was going to last that long. All right, and 3, they end up fleeing the country because it was too hard to live there because they were not prepared for it properly. All right, so now you being here in the United States, the same thing could happen. How long from now? I don't know. They're saying that within the next 10 years, food prices will rise 400%. And that could be whatever it is that you buy food now. And, the example that I gave on that podcast is that the government in North Carolina, I believe it was, they're giving the maximum to the family of 4, which is $646 in food stamps. When you add the 400% increase, the same $646 can only buy $122 worth of groceries. So that's how you see the inflation work. All right. And in one point, Venezuela got to 10 million% inflation, which of course is ridiculous. A lot of people don't believe it, but it happened. They have to pay, well, if we talk in the same terms as dollars, they have to pay $400,000 just to buy some eggs. All right, just think how much eggs are at the store right now. $3, $4, $5, whatever it is, which is it's expensive right now. But the point is that compare that to $400,000, it becomes less likely that you're gonna be able to buy anything else other than the essential food that you're gonna need to live on every day. All right, so the next thing that I have for you really shows how the collapse is happening, because this proves the point that I was just speaking about Venezuela. Democrat-run Chicago broke its mayor malls, tax hikes, and layoffs to plug $1.2 billion budget gap. And that is from Zero Hedge. I just want to talk about the headline real quick. We know that there's 39 states that could not pay their debts. And as you're going to see here in a minute, it has increased. I believe it's 46. But anyways, the point is that the main thing that we have been discussing in this podcast, not just on this one in particular, but what I'm talking about the podcast as a whole, is that there's layoffs, there's tax hikes, because the government has to pay for it somehow. So they raise the tax on the rich. What happens? The rich leave the state very, very quickly. We saw it in New York. And you know what New York did? You know what Cuomo did? He begged them to come back. And he was forced to lower taxes so he could have the rich people come back and do business in New York, so the government could, continue with the revenue. The same thing is happening here. And it would be the same thing that we would have if all of this was happening in a much nationwide scale, all right? The article goes on to say, in a sign of where the entire country could soon find itself, the Democrat-run city of Chicago isn't just facing soaring violent crime, but is staring down a whopping $1.2 billion budget deficit. The Chicago Tribune reports, quote, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot is considering a $94 million property tax increase, layoffs of more than 300 city workers, and a gas tax hike as part of her plan to close a $1.2 billion budget deficit, source told the Tribune. She expected to present her plan on Wednesday, which is, according to the summary in Fox and Chicago Tribune, to additionally include a 5-day furlough for all non-union city employees. Pretty much you're not getting paid and you're not working. Shifting some costs onto the books of the Chicago Public Schools, including asking Chicago Public Schools to reimburse city for $40 million more in school pension contribution, raising the cloud computing tax, up to 350 layoffs of civic employees, possible $77 million cuts to fulfill positions or more than 1,000 vacancies. The problem has been building for years, given already the city was strapped with $46.5 billion in unpaid bills and only a reported $10 billion cash on hand, based on a damning review of the city finances released this summer by Truth in Accounting. All right, so those are going to be the very first casualties of this government not being able to afford to pay anybody. All right, so here's several things. One, they're raising taxes. They're going to raise tax probably on everyone. It doesn't really specify who. They didn't say if you make so much money, then you're going to pay this much in taxes. Or if you own this type of building, then you're going to have your taxes risen. The point is that, let's say it was the entire Chicago, right? It didn't matter how much money you made, how little money you made. Not only are they increasing the taxes, the property tax on everyone, they're also laying off 300 city workers. Now, it didn't specify if that's 300 plus the other 350, making it 650 layoffs, or they just added 50 more at the bottom of the article. Anyways, the point is that they're also increasing the gas tax, just so they can close a gap of $1.2 billion. But they have unpaid bills of $46 billion, $46.5 billion, and they only have $10 billion cash on hand. Pretty much saying that if they were to give the entire $10 billion to the people they owe money to, they would still be short $36.5 billion. And what happens when all the rich people leave Chicago? Then all those taxes are going to trickle down to the people who actually stay. All right, so that's why I keep making the comparison about people who are going to have the money to actually flee the country. They're going to flee the country. And if you have plans, if you're one of these rich people listening to this podcast, and you are planning to leave the country, then you have to make sure that you leave before they implement any type of lockdown in the United States because of the coronavirus, making travel illegal. That's what we're seeing in Paris. And as I shared with you in the previous podcast, I want to read to you the headline again, because now I feel like I need to make a podcast about the second lockdown. They're talking about it even more, because when I discussed it in the past, not as many countries were actually getting into the whole lockdown train as they are now. So the article comes from the Daily Mail, and it says, "Escape from Paris. City is gridlocked as tens of thousands flee. Stations are packed. Violent protests break out, and shelves are stripped ahead of month-long lockdown that bans travel." And as I've mentioned in the previous podcast, is that they're gonna implement all these rules and regulations that even if you so much as stick your nose out of your front door, they're gonna want to have documentation on why you felt like you needed to stick your nose out of your door. So things are getting pretty hard. And again, another point that I wanted to make sure that you understand is that if you do flee the country, if you do flee the United States, for one, you have to make sure that wherever it is that you're going to spend the apocalypse in, you have all your preps there in place. But not only that, just because you're escaping the United States economic collapse doesn't mean you're going to avoid a European economic collapse. So keep that in mind if you have plans on leaving this country anytime soon, whether it's because of the pandemic or because of the election. All right, so the next headline that I have for you is very important, because the way that the United States makes its money is by giving out bonds, not only just on the trades and everything, but one of the main ways is to buy bonds, that people buy bonds. So pretty much just to clarify what a bond is for people who may not know, it's pretty much you give the government, let's say $100, just to round up numbers. If you gave the government $100, so they can fund itself, and the bond had a 10% payout to you, right? You give the government 100, they give you 10% back every month for, let's say, a year. You get to keep the $10 they gave you a month, but not only that, they return to you the $100 you gave them to begin with. So that's one of the ways the government funds itself, because you gave it the $100 and then they give it to you back, making more money from everybody else. But the point is that is coming to an end. People are realizing that they're losing money. Here's the headline from Zero Hedge. Creditors finally wake up to an apocalyptic reality. Bond losses as high as 99%. And I also have another video from Peter Schiff explaining some of this. Here it is.
If somebody has a problem, they have to solve that problem. They can't look to government. Government is not a crutch to solve problems, because if people need resources, right, which is what people need, right? They're lacking in resources. They don't have their incomes, right? They don't have money coming in because they're not working. So they need resources. The government doesn't have any. The government is not sitting on a pile of real money to give out to people when they need it. The government only can give to some people what it takes from other people. So to the extent that the government helps somebody, it does that by taking money away from somebody else. So what the government is doing is forcing the people who don't need help to help the people who do. Now, of course, a lot of these government programs, though, like the PPP was a perfectly good example. A lot of people who didn't need help got it anyway. That is the problem with government. Because whenever you have all this government reallocation of resources, even if some people are helped at other people's expense, overall, the entire economy is left worse off. So even if you're going to buy the idea that the government should help people who need help by taking money from other people who don't, the overall effect on the economy is going to be a negative. So the whole economy is going to be worse off, even if some people are better off as a result of what the government does. But they never talk about it in those terms. And of course, if there is going to be government help, it should be on a state level. It should not be on a federal level. It should be state by state. It should be state governments that are surveying the landscape. And if they think there's an emergency and there are certain citizens of their states that need help, well, they should figure out which citizens in their states can afford to supply that help. Whose taxes have to go up so that other people can get a check. But everybody thinks that all we have to do is print money, right? If the Fed just creates money and everybody can have what they need and it doesn't cost anybody anything. And, as long as the world is dumb enough to allow this to continue, they're going to be right, which is why I think the world is going to wake up and cut us off. That's why we're headed for this currency crisis, because we are going to do this. We're going to take advantage of the world until the world wises up and decides that it doesn't want to be taken advantage of anymore. But the other point that nobody seems to make is, why is everybody, so desperate for help? Why does everybody need all this money? Why can't they take care of themselves? Now they want to say, well, because it's the virus just came out of left field. I know it came out of left field. So did World War II. So did a lot of bad things. But we lived through it. People didn't need help from the government because people were financially solvent. People had savings. People were prepared. The fact that we weren't prepared at all, that's the problem no one wants to talk about. Why is it that Americans are loaded up with debt and living paycheck to paycheck? Why is the same thing true for so many businesses? Why are the credit losses now going to be horrific? You're talking about a lot of these companies now going bankrupt and the lenders, the unsecured lenders, losing everything. They're not going to get 50 cents on the dollar. They're going to get no cents on the dollar. Why? Because the Federal Reserve kept interest rates so low for so long that people and companies were able to borrow far more money than they ever would have been able to borrow during a normal lending environment. So it's because of the Federal Reserve that the society, that the country is so levered up. That's why we're so vulnerable. That's why everybody needs so much help, because the government crippled everybody with its monetary policies and also the fiscal policies. And so now, of course, we can't walk and we think, so we need more government crutches so we can limp around, without realizing that all that is doing is exacerbating the problems that already exist. I mean, we've got to, fess up to reality and stop trying to sober up by drinking more alcohol. But it is a very sobering understanding to have to do that, right? For reality to be dealt with, and stop pretending that there's a government cure for what ails us. We're sick because we overdosed on government cures. So nobody has these conversations. Yeah, people need money. Companies need money. And so we have to stop playing politics and give them the money. Playing politics is giving them the money. The reason that everybody needs the money is because we played politics in the past by making them so dependent on that money. By trying to delay and mitigate every single recession, now we're in a depression. Had we allowed market forces to operate, we would have had a much healthier economy going into COVID-19 instead of a bubble. And the problem with bubbles is, sooner or later, they always find a pin. So you can't keep talking about the pin. You can't be saying it's all COVID and excuse the bubble that the pin pricked. Because if it wasn't this pin, it would have been another pin. So you can't let the Federal Reserve off the hook. You can't let Congress off the hook and say, hey, it's not their fault because they couldn't have predicted COVID. Maybe, maybe not, but they could have predicted that something bad would happen. I mean, just Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And so if COVID didn't go wrong, something would have. It's just that we wouldn't prepare for anything, whether it was COVID or anything else. So what's happening now was destined to happen. It was unavoidable. But what's also unavoidable is what's going to happen next. Because what's going to happen next is going to be much worse than what's already happened, because we've been able to mitigate the downturn so far because we've been able to keep printing dollars, and we've been able to spend those dollars because the value hasn't collapsed. When this kicks into a whole new gear is when the dollar collapses. And then it doesn't do you any good that the government printed up some dollars and gave them to you, because there's very little you can buy with them.
All right, so he made it very, very clear right there, towards the end, that eventually people are going to stop letting the United States borrow money. And it's not just the individual people, but it's also governments. For example, China, they hold the most bonds on the United States. The money that they let us borrow in order for us to continue to be able to do the things that we need to do. For example, putting so much money into the Social Security, not Social Security, into the EBTs, putting all the money into the Pentagon, or the Army, and places like that. So eventually that's going to stop. When, we don't know when. We're starting to hear about the Great Reset, as I mentioned earlier, and I guess we're just going to have to wait and see whether they do come out with a total digital currency in the future. It's still going to have to be backed up by something, and more than likely they're going to try to use gold. We don't know, but I guess we'll have to see and wait and see. Now, of course, that has put us into a very deep depression, as he had mentioned in the video as well. And the next thing that I have for you is from the from the Wall Street Journal. And it says, U.S. states face biggest cash crisis since the Great Depression. Nationwide, the U.S. state budget shortfall from 2020 through 2022 could amount to about $434 billion, according to the data from Moody's Analytics, the economy analysis arms of Moody's Corp. The estimate assumes no additional fiscal stimulus from Washington, further coronavirus-fueling restrictions on businesses and travel, and extra costs on Medicaid amid high unemployment. Deficits have already prompted tax hikes and cuts to the education, correction, and parks. State workers are being laid off and are taking pay cuts. And the retirement benefits for police, firefighters, teachers, and other government workers are under more pressure. Even after rainy day funds are used, Moody's Analytics projects 46 states coming up short, with Nevada, Louisiana, and Florida having the greatest gaps as a percentage of their 2019 budget. Louisiana said it didn't expect its shortfall to be as large as Moody's projected. Quote, "There's no real crisis for a crisis like this," end quote, said New Jersey Treasurer Elizabeth Mayer Moa. It's going to be tough for the next couple of years. All right, so the signs are there. They're telling us from different aspects of the economy, from different aspects of corporations and people who actually know how all this stuff works. They're letting us know right now that we're facing Great Depression, that we're facing a big cash crisis, that we're facing losses in the bond market. So there's a lot of things that we really need to prepare for. Or not prepare for. There's this one major event to prepare for, but what I'm saying is that there's many things to do in order for you to have a successful preparedness for that event. All right, and again, as I mentioned a minute ago, it doesn't really matter where you go. You're gonna have to really prepare for wherever you decide to spend the apocalypse. Here's my last headline for the night: the destruction of the euro. This from Zero Hedge. The eurozone is bust. The deterioration of targets to imbalances have been hardly noticed, but in recent months it has been alarming. Despite official denials over the years that it is a matter of concern, it is increasingly obvious that the national banks of Italy, Spain, and other nations with increasing bad debts are hiding them within the Target 2 system. The first wave of COVID-19 which is leading the bankruptcies throughout the Eurozone, is now being followed by a second wave, which will almost certainly take out a number of important banks, in which case the cross-border Euro system will implode. All right, so again, it doesn't matter where you go. Rich people have been going to Europe, escaping what has been happening in the United States, but they're going to face it there too. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, and as I mentioned with Mike Adams when I had that interview, I did say that this is a global thing. It's not just the United States. This is a global thing that's going on everywhere. And it has to happen. In order for them to be able to establish a brand new system, they're going to have hyperinflation all throughout the world. At the very least, having collapsing economies, in the sense that their money is not good, even if there's a hyperinflation or not. The economy has to be very, very bad. People have to be hurting and begging for a new system, so it'll be a smooth transition from one place to another. Alternative media like me and others, we are sharing the information that if it's planned, it's an evil plan, and people who are making those decisions have to pay for it. But there's a lot of people out there who do not follow the alternative media. They follow the mainstream media, and they don't think beyond, what they're seeing and what is happening, thinking that somebody's doing it to them. So those people are the ones that are going to have a smooth transition from one aspect to the next. But people like me, people like you who are listening to this podcast, other podcast people who are also talking about this, we're the ones that are going to have the hard time transitioning, because, we care about what the Bible says about the beast system. We care about whether or not we're going to get chipped, whether or not we're going to get vaccinated, whether or not that is going to be the one condition for us to be able to still have a home, still be able to have a job, still be able to pay our bills, stuff like that, or become homeless the very next day. So those are going to be the problems that we're going to have, that we're going to face as the alternative media, as the alternative people, I guess, as opposed to the people who are in line with what the mainstream media says, or the plans that they're putting into place. And we have to really prepare for that. And as I mentioned, I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, you're going to have gold in order for you to be able to trade, whether it is going to be a new currency, a paper fiat, or if it's going to be a cryptocurrency of any type. You're going to have the gold for it. But not just that, that's just one layer. The next layer is that you're going to have to be able to make your own food, resupply your own water, and really understand what it takes to actually run a little farm. And you have to do that from day to day. If you don't practice every single day, you won't be able to do it successfully. Especially if you think that you're just going to flip the switch and you're just going to become the best gardener or the best rancher that there ever was. And that is just not the case. There's a lot of learning curves. There's a lot of money that has to be spent into it in order for you to have the systems in place. So you need to prepare now if you haven't been able to. And again, the window of opportunity is closing. When is it going to close? No idea. We have been talking about this exact subject for many, many years. All right. The last time the United States experienced anything like this was back in 2008. So it's been about 12 years now, and we're going through it again. Now, if you started preparing for something like that since the last time it happened, then you had 12 years, and you should be in the best, fantastic shape as far as prepping goes in order to withstand what is happening now. But if you didn't, then take the opportunity. If things go back to normal, or you're still working, you're still living your life pretty normal, as opposed to just, you're still living your life pretty normal, including the inconvenience of all these guidelines and wearing a mask and everything. If you're still having a regular life that is not really affecting you very much, all the guidelines are in place, then you really need to start working for when this system implodes. So I encourage you to do that. Please share this information far and wide. Please help us to get to the 1,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it that you came and you stayed all the way to the end. Please remember that this podcast is sponsored by my store, ManMadeSurvivalStore.com. And also remember that we are giving away a book. It's Preppers Secrete Cache. You can go to www.PreppersSecretCache.com and you can order it from there, or you can just go to the ManMadeSurvival store front page and you're going to be able to click on it and it'll take you to the page where you order the book for free. And again, the book is free. All we need your help is with shipping. So please help us out. Please share this information, and please be prepared. But anyways, I want to leave you with that. Again, my name is Jose Prado, always ready.
The Man-Made Survival Show.